So my life's been sort of crazy the last little while, and I have a variety of projects in the works, but I wanted to do a video this month, and so I figured I'd just talk about something that I really enjoyed. And that is, of course, Netflix's Jim Henson's The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance. This is a Netflix series based on the Jim Henson movie from the 80s. And it's just really great. I really wanted to talk about this series because it's kind of the antithesis to everything I hate about modern movies and shows. It's really good, and it just has that movie magic vibe about it. No, I never grew up with the Dark Crystal movie. I did grow up with the Muppets and Sesame Street and obviously Star Wars and things like that Jim Henson had worked on. But I don't have an affinity or nostalgia towards the Dark Crystal movie that some people do. I watched it recently as it came on Netflix a few months ago, and I thought, well, yeah, I might as well check that out since I've heard a lot of people really like it. I think the puppets and creature effects are fantastic as per usual, especially the Skeksis and the old ancient guys, I forget what they're called, but I thought the story was a little bit formulaic and the characters a little bit bland. I really liked the world and the creativity in the design of everything, but there wasn't really anything in the story that really gripped me. So flash forward to this series comes out. Netflix produces a Jim Henson Company TV series based on the Dark Crystal property. It's another reboot of an 80s property, but this time it's good. I would say it's even better than the original, which is pretty rare. So not only is it a good... Fuck. Go away, planes! So not only is it a good modern reboot, it's a prequel that's better than the original. When has that ever happened before? So what makes this series so good and compelling? Well, first of all, the puppets. Obviously the puppets were great in the original, no one's discounting that, and that's kind of the charm of that movie. And that's something that I've always really liked about the Dark Crystal, is that every character is a puppet. There aren't any humans anywhere, it's just puppet characters. This series keeps that, and it uses almost entirely practical effects, as well as real sets, a lot of matte paintings, and just old school film techniques that you don't see very often. They've also definitely improved upon the effects from the original. In the original movies, the Skeksis and the Ancients are really, really great because they kind of have beak-like mouths, so the puppetry works really well to bring those characters to life. And then there's these other minor characters called podlings that look a lot like Muppets, and they're great too. They're more kind of comedic side characters, but like they show a lot of expression in their movement. When it comes to the main characters, the Gelflings, who are just kind of like elves, they always felt like really wooden and restricted in the original movie to me. And that was kind of my biggest worry going into this series, is it's not only focusing on those being, the Gelflings being the main characters, but there's even more of them this time. But they fucking nailed it. There's a lot of improvements made to the Gelflings, as well as like some computer animation techniques to help them like blink and have a little more expression in their eyes. But whatever it is, it really helps to bring those characters to life, and they have a lot more movement and stuff that they can do in this series. But it isn't just that makes them more effective. It's really the story is just that much more well written. You have 10 episodes to spend with these characters, so there's a lot more time to focus on developing their personalities and to just give them time to grow as characters. The original movie spent a lot of that time that could be spent on character development just kind of exploring the world. And the world is fascinating, but they do a much better job of exploring it in this series, and they get all the basic information you need to know out of the way very early on, so that we can really just kind of see these characters grow and change on this journey. But it's not just that too, it's also that this series has a phenomenal voice cast. Jason Isaacs, Mark Hamill, Simon Pegg, Taron Egerton is in this series. Lena Headey, the Tyrell chick, and the black girl that's in the Fast and Furious movies are also in this show. So this series is not only like a fun fantasy adventure, but it's also like a low-key Game of Thrones reunion / replacement. The cinematography is also really awesome in this series. There's a lot of like really fluid camera movements, just showing off all these different hand-built sets and and worlds and just all the different creatures and puppets and stuff that were handmade. And there's a lot of like really fluid camera movement that you wouldn't expect to work or to be done at all in a show with puppets, where normally the camera's very locked down so that you don't see any of the performers that are just below the frame. But because of this, it helps to make it feel much more alive and much more like a real world. But it's not just one of these things that makes the series work, it's the fact that all of them are being used in tandem to really just create a magical movie experience. It's not just that the puppets are good, it's that they're being performed by talented puppeteers and being voiced by talented actors reading a great script that tells a good story and that's shot in an interesting way. It's all of those things together that makes this show something special. There's a behind-the-scenes documentary that Netflix also did that I, of course, watched as soon as I was done the series that really breaks down how incredible this crew was literally every step of the way. They had to like design so many details that really fleshed out this world and things like that. It reminds me of the Lord of the Rings documentary about like how in detail they went into like the little things, like making sure that there was a scene of Aragorn sharpening his sword so that we would know, oh, okay, that's how his sword stays sharp, and like designing the look of different places in the world and things like that. Like they talk about how the crew just went over and above on like every single step of the way. They talk about how there was like this one scene they had where they're like, oh, it'd be fun if we had like a podling that didn't want to take a bath, and then by the time it gets into production they spent just like hours designing like a dozen different podlings that all didn't want to take a bath in a different way, and it just became this larger than life sequence that kind of sells this like kind of goofy concept, but because they spent so much time on it, it like works in a weird way. The series is also just like a really fascinating exploration of this world and this storyline. They realized early on that the way to go about doing a Dark Crystal reboot was to do what made it work in the first place and make it and focus on puppets and practical effects and return to that world without just redoing it. So what we get is like this prequel to the main story. Why would that be more interesting than the original movie? And why is this the story to tell? And also, isn't the problem with most prequels that you sort of know the ending, and so most tension is kind of not there? In most cases, that's true. I equate this story to basically like if The Force Awakens came out first, and then they made the original trilogy of Star Wars movies, and that's what this series is, where it's like, oh, this is what it's supposed to be. Like this is the real interesting story. And then The Force Awakens, we just get echoes of what the world was and the thing that was actually more interesting. It's basically like your very standard fantasy. There's bad guys that are oppressing the good guys, and so they form a rebellion to stand against that. And the series is about the forming of that rebellion. Where in the original movie, it's just about like this one guy going on a hero's journey. But what keeps it interesting, even knowing where the story is going, is that it is like the original trilogy, but if the rebellion inevitably loses the war. Which in a weird way makes this show even more engaging. Because you're meeting all these new characters, and as they develop over the course of the series, you really start to root for them. But in the back of your mind, you know that they will inevitably fail. We just don't know how that's going to happen. This also helps the show because it gives them the freedom to invent new characters and then kill them off. And they kill off a bunch of characters in this show that's like a puppet fantasy thing, arguably for kids, but also arguably not, because there's some characters that get killed like really brutally. There's a death at the end of episode 4 that I was just like blown away by, and it was just like, wow, I have to keep watching. I have to find out what happens. And so because any of these characters can die, and some of them we know will eventually die, it makes it so that there's always this tension of uncertainty for these characters' future. On top of all of this, it's this wonderful fantasy series that has all these classical themes, just like Star Wars, of technology versus nature and dictatorship being overthrown by democracy, and good versus evil. There's a magic sword they have to get, which I always love when fantasy stories do that. And it's just this larger than life, otherworldly thing that we hadn't really seen anything like since the 80s, when Star Wars was really big and people were trying to tell those stories. It's these timeless mythological elements that are just always compelling to watch. And that paired with just all these amazing pieces that all work in tandem with each other to flesh out a fantastical world so thoroughly, but it's still grounded in a sense of humanity and familiarity. I don't want to call it too early, but it might be my favorite thing since Star Wars, like the original Star Wars. I don't know, it's just really great. And it's like, I'm trying to get into the film industry, and like when I was done watching the series, I immediately started watching the documentary, and I'm like, that's it. That's what I want to do. How do I get on that set? And it's the magic of movies, and you don't see that very often anymore. There are some flaws with this series. There's a few minor characters that aren't fleshed out very well, which is not really an issue, except that a lot of the characters look very similar, and so some of the time I'm like, wait, who is that character again? Have we seen her before? Wait, which of the three sisters is this one? And stuff like that. And there is some CGI. Most of the time it's used in like a green screen way or in tandem with practical effects, just to enhance it and to make things feel on a grander scale, or things like that. Like there's a lot of flying effects that are obviously done on green screen, but always with a puppet as well. But there is a few shots that are like almost entirely CG, and it's like, okay, that's kind of noticeable, and it takes you out of it a little bit. But they're pretty few and far between, and most of the time you don't notice it at all, and it actually is used quite sparingly, only to enhance the practical effects. But yeah, check out Netflix's The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance. It's really fucking good. You don't need to watch the original movie to be on board with this series. There's only like a few hints of things that later shows up in the movie, but most of the stuff you can just kind of start, and it introduces everything you need to know about the world. And yeah, you can pretty much just start from episode 1 and be able to follow everything. Although Netflix's formula of making stuff is kind of strange, because they kind of just let their creators do whatever they want, which means that there's no real quality control, which is why we get so many bad things on Netflix. But every now and then they let the creators do whatever they want, and the creators know what they're doing, and we get something really special like this. It's probably my favorite thing this year that's come out this year, and it might be one of my favorite things of all time. So just please check it out, because it's really fucking great. That's about it. Thanks for watching.